I have told this story exactly twice in the years since. Once to my wife, the night I came home from the capital, when she asked why my eyes were red and I could not at first answer her. And once, much later at a graveside, to a young man who needed to hear it. I will tell it a third time now and try to tell it whole, because I have come to believe that some things a man witnesses are not given to him for his own keeping. They are given to him to carry. My name is Tomas Aldercott, and at the time of this I was a saddler by trade, 46 years old, with a small workshop in a market town 3 days' ride from the capital. I am not a man given to wonder. My days were spent with leather and waxed thread, and the patient stitching of things meant to last, and I had grown into the habit of measuring the world the way I measured a strap, by whether it would hold, by whether it had been made honestly. I tell you this so you understand that what I saw that morning at the Lion Gate of Selden Court did not find a credulous man. It found a man who trusted his own eyes and very little else, and it broke something open in him all the same. I had come to the capital on a commission. A gentleman of some standing had ordered a full set of carriage harness from me, fine work, brass and oxblood leather, and he had asked that I deliver it to his townhouse myself rather than trust it to a carrier. The fee was generous enough that I did not argue. I came up by the river road, stayed 2 nights at a coaching inn near the fish market, and on the morning I am speaking of I had finished my business early and found myself with a few free hours before my return. I had never seen the changing of the guard at Selden Court. A man does not live in the kingdom of Hartmere all his life without hearing of it. The Selden foot guards in their gray mantles and tall black caps, the precision of the drill, the way the whole spectacle is said to stop a crowd's breath. My own father had spoken of it once, late in his life, in the particular voice he saved for things he respected. He had been a soldier himself, in his younger years, in a war that the histories now treat as a footnote, and that cost him 2 fingers on his left hand, and most of his hearing on the side where the gun had stood. He was not a sentimental man either. But he had said to me once near the end that the Selden guards were the only men he had ever envied, not for their fine clothes, he said, but because they had been allowed to keep their discipline into peacetime, when the rest of us had had to set ours down and become ordinary again. So I went. I told myself it was idle curiosity, a way to pass a free morning, but I think now I went for him. The Lion Gate stands at the north face of Selden Court, where the great forecourt opens onto the public square. It takes its name from the 2 stone lions that flank the central arch, worn smooth across the centuries, so that they look less like beasts now and more like old men dozing in the sun. The gate itself is a thing of black iron and gilded points, taller than 3 men, and on either side of it the sentry boxes stand against the pale stone of the palace wall. The guards keep their posts there in the open, behind a low rail of polished brass that holds the public back a respectful distance. A man can come within a few feet of them. He can look into their faces. He cannot make them look back. I arrived to find the forecourt in a state I had not expected. There was to be a pageant, I gathered some royal occasion a fortnight off, a procession and a ceremony, and the morning's business was a rehearsal of it. Men in shirt sleeves were laying out lines of chalk across the cobbles. A band stood off to one side, working through a march in fits and starts, the bandmaster stopping them every few bars to scold a horn. Carpenters were raising a reviewing stand against the far wall, and the whole great space rang with hammering and shouted instructions, and the particular irritable energy of important men preparing for a more important day. And through the middle of all of it moved the man I would come to think of as the architect of everything that followed. I did not know his name at first. I learned it later. Price, master of ceremonies for the occasion, a man whose whole profession was the arrangement of how things should look. He was perhaps 50, well-fed, dressed in a coat too fine for the work he was doing, and he carried a folded sheaf of papers that he consulted constantly and never seemed to read. He had the manner of a man who has discovered that the surest way to seem important is to be perpetually dissatisfied. He moved among the workmen correcting things, the angle of a flag, the spacing of the chalk lines, the placement of a potted bay tree that had been set out to soften the look of the stand. And everywhere he passed he left a small wake of resentment behind him, the silent resentment of men who know their work and are being told otherwise by a man who does not. I mention all of this because I want you to understand the world that the old man walked into. It was a world entirely given over that morning to the question of how things would appear. Every chalk line, every flag, every potted tree existed to make a picture, and price was its keeper. But before I tell you of the old man, I must tell you of the guard. There were two on duty at the lion gate, one at each box, but it is the one on the left, the western box, nearest where I stood, that I watched. He was younger than I had imagined the Selden guards to be, though I suppose every guard is young to a man of 46. He stood at his post in the gray mantle and the tall black cap, the chin strap drawn down across his jaw, his rifle held at the order, its butt grounded by his right boot, his white-gloved hands one over the other on the muzzle. He looked at first glance like a thing made rather than born. He did not shift his weight. He did not turn his head. His eyes were fixed on some point in the middle distance, above the heads of the crowd, and they did not waver from it. I have stitched leather for 30 years, and I will tell you that there is a quality of stillness that only comes from training, that cannot be faked by a man simply holding himself rigid. A statue is still because it cannot move. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who could move very fast, I thought, if it came to it, and who had decided completely not to. There is a tension in it, a held thing, like a drawn bow that does not tremble. I found I could not look away from him. The whole loud, busy forecourt churned around him, and he stood at the center of it, unmoved. And the longer I watched, the more it seemed to me that he was the only fixed point in the place, the one thing that the morning's frantic arranging could not touch. The crowd along the rail was the ordinary crowd of such places. Visitors with their children up on their shoulders. Two young women who kept trying to make the guard smile and giggling when he would not. An old fellow sketching the gate in a notebook. A scattering of folk from the provinces like myself, come to see the thing they had heard of. We stood in the sun and watched the guard and the rehearsal both, and the morning was a fine one, and for a while nothing happened at all. Then the old man came. I saw him from some distance, because he moved so slowly that the eye caught on him the way it catches on anything that does not move at the speed of everything around it. He came across the square from the direction of the fish market, threading between the carriages, and at first I took him for a beggar, and I am ashamed now to say that I looked away from him, because that is what a man learns to do. But when he came closer, I saw that I had judged him wrongly, and the manner of my error has stayed with me. He was old, truly old, 80 at the least, perhaps more, and he was poor. That much was plain. His coat was threadbare at the cuffs and shiny at the elbows, and had been mended more than once with a hand that had grown unsteady. His boots were cracked, but the coat was brushed. The boots were polished, cracked as they were, polished with a care that must have cost him an hour and a sore back. His thin white hair was combed. His chin was shaved, not perfectly. There was a nick on his jaw where the razor had wandered, but shaved that morning deliberately. He had dressed for something. A poor man does not polish cracked boots for nothing. He polishes them because he is going somewhere that matters to him, and he wants to arrive as well as he is able. He carried, pressed against his chest with both hands the way a man carries a thing he is afraid of dropping, a small flat object wrapped in a clean cloth. He came to the rail perhaps a dozen feet from where I stood, on the western side, near the box of the guard I had been watching, and he stopped there. He did not push to the front. He waited until a place opened, and then he took it quietly, and he set his hands on the brass rail and he looked at the gate. I have seen many men look at many things. I had never, until that morning, seen a man look at a place the way he looked at that gate. It was not the look of a visitor. A visitor's eyes move, they take the scene in pieces, the lions, the gilding, the guards, the great doors beyond. His eyes did not move. They settled on the western sentry box, on the patch of cobbles directly before it, the worn place where the guard's boots had stood and the boots of 1,000 guards before him, and they stayed there, and his face, I will try to describe his face, though I am not the man to do it justice. His face was the face of a man who has come home after a very long time and found the house still standing. He was breathing hard from the walk. I could see his shoulders working. And after a moment he did a thing that I did not understand at first and that I have never forgotten since. He straightened. It cost him, I saw it cost him, saw the wince of it travel up through his bent back, but he drew his shoulders back and lifted his chin and brought his cracked, polished boots together, heels touching, and he stood, as well as a body of 80-odd years would let him stand, at attention, facing the gate, facing the worn place on the cobbles. An old, poor, trembling man, standing to attention before a sentry box, while 100 feet away a band rehearsed a march, and a fat man in a fine coat fussed over the angle of a flag. Nobody noticed him but me, and I did not understand what I was seeing. I only knew that I could not look away from it, and that my throat had grown tight for a reason I could not have named. It was Price who noticed him next. I saw the steward's eye fall on the old man the way a steward's eye falls on a stain, a thing out of place, in a scene he was responsible for arranging. He was perhaps 30 feet off, directing the placement of a banner, and I watched his gaze snag on the old figure at the rail, and I watched the small, involuntary grimace cross his face, the grimace of a man whose careful picture has been spoiled by something he did not put there. He looked at the threadbare coat and the cracked boots and the white hair, and I saw him reach a conclusion, and the conclusion was wrong, and it was the kind of wrong that a certain sort of man arrives at instantly and never questions. He came over. He did not hurry. He came with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never in his life doubted his right to move other men along. "You," he said when he reached the rail. He did not raise his voice yet. "Move along, please. This area is being prepared. We can't have," and here his eye traveled down the old man once more, the coat, the boots, the wrapped thing held against the chest. "We can't have loiterers. There's a pageant. Move along." The old man turned his head. He looked at Price with a kind of mild, courteous confusion, the way a man looks at someone speaking to him in a language he half remembers. "I'm not loitering, sir," he said. His voice was thin, but it was steady, and it had in it, faint but unmistakable, a particular cadence. I knew it at once because my father had had it. The flattened vowels of an old soldier, the words set down in order like men in a line. "I've come to stand my watch just for a while. I'll not be any trouble." "Your watch," Price repeated, and he smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who has found something he can be amused by. "You haven't got a watch, old fellow. You're standing at a public rail in a coat that's seen better decades, and you're spoiling the line of my reviewing party. Now I've asked you nicely. Move along, or I'll have someone move you." I waited for the old man to wither. That is what I expected, that he would shrink and mumble and shuffle away, the way the old and the poor learn to shuffle away from men in fine coats. I had seen it 100 times. It is one of the small daily cruelties of the world that we have all agreed not to look at. He did not shuffle away. He turned back to face the gate, and he set his hands on the rail again, and he said quietly, not looking at Price, "I'll not move, sir. Not yet. I've earned the standing of it. I'll go when I've stood my time." I did not understand his words, but I understood his spine, and so, I think, did the guard. I must be careful here because what I am about to describe happened in the smallest possible compass, in details so slight that I might have missed them if I had not been watching the young guard so closely already. He did not move. Let me be clear on that. He did not break his post, not then. His rifle stayed at the order. His eyes stayed fixed on their distant point. To Price, to the crowd, to anyone not looking for it, he was as still as he had been all morning, but I was looking for it. And I saw his eyes change. They did not turn, he did not let them turn, but the focus of them shifted, pulled, the way a man's eyes pull toward a sound he is forbidden to look at. And I saw his jaw set beneath the chin strap, a tightening so faint I could not have sworn to it in a court of law. And I understood, watching him, that the young guard had heard every word, and that something in the old man's words had reached him in a way the rest of us could not follow. He had heard, "I've come to stand my watch, and I've earned the standing of it," and where Price had heard the ramblings of a vagrant, the guard had heard something else. He had heard a password. He had heard a man speaking the language of the place, the true language of it, the one beneath the chalk lines and the flags, but he held his post. Of course he held his post. That was his whole purpose and his whole pride. A guard does not leave his box because a steward is unkind to an old man at the rail. The world is full of unkindness, and the guard's duty is to stand, not to fix it. So he stood, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes had changed, and he waited as he had been trained to wait, for the thing to pass. It did not pass. It got worse, the way these things do when one man has decided to be cruel and another man has refused to be cowed. Price did not like being refused. I have learned across my life that a certain kind of small man can bear almost anything except the discovery that someone weaker than himself will not obey. It humiliates him, because his whole sense of his own size is built on the obedience of the people beneath him, and when one of them stands firm, the floor drops out of his self-regard, and he must do something to restore it. He must make the refusal cost. "What's that you're holding?" Price said, and his voice had changed. The amusement had curdled out of it and left something harder. "Come on, what have you got there? Begging cup, bottle, let's see it." "It's nothing of yours, sir," the old man said. "It's whatever I say it is on this forecourt this morning," Price said, and he reached across the rail and took hold of the old man's arm. I heard the crowd around me draw breath. The two young women had stopped giggling. The man with the sketchbook had lowered it. The old fellow flinched at the grip. It was not a gentle one, and he turned. And in turning, his hands came loose from the wrapped thing he held, and it fell. It fell to the cobbles between them, and the cloth came open, and I saw what it was. It was a frame. A small wooden frame, the glass of it cracked across one corner, and behind the glass, mounted on faded blue cloth, were medals. 3 of them. War medals, the ribbons gone pale with age, the metal of them dark, and beside them in the same frame, pinned to the cloth, a single brass cap badge of a design I did not know but that I would learn before the morning was out. A lion couchant above a scroll, the badge of the Selden Foot Guards as it had been worn 50 years before in the old pattern, before the regiment changed its facings. The old man made a sound. I will not forget that sound. It was not a cry of pain, though Price's grip must have hurt him. It was the sound a man makes when a thing he has carried carefully and at great cost is suddenly on the ground in front of him. The small broken sound of of a lifetime's care undone in an instant. He went down after it, went down to his knees on the cobbles, his old joints folding badly, and reached for the frame with both hands, gathering it up, checking the glass, his fingers shaking. And Price, God help him, I think he did not even see what had fallen. I think he was so far inside his own annoyance that the medals were just clutter to him. Just more of the mess this loitering old fool was making of his morning, Price said, loud now, loud enough that the workmen turned to look. Get up and get out. I've had enough of this. Guard." He turned to the western sentry box. He pointed at the old man on his knees. "Guard, do your duty. Remove this man from the gate. I want to stop here in the telling and hold this moment still, the way it has held still in my memory all these years. Because everything turned on what happened next, and what happened next happened in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, and I have spent a great deal of my life since trying to understand exactly what passed through that young man's mind in those 4 seconds. He had his orders. Not from Price. Price had no authority over him, as it turned out, none at all, but from the deeper, older orders that governed his whole existence as a guard. Stand your post. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not react. Hold whatever comes. That was the iron law of him, and it was not a small thing. It was the thing he had given his discipline to, the thing that made him what he was. A guard who leaves his post for an old man at a rail is, in the strict accounting of his trade, a guard who has failed. The whole meaning of the Selden Foot Guards, the thing my father had envied, the thing the crowd came to see, was that they did not break, that they could not be made to break. Not by mockery, not by the 2 laughing girls, not by anything. And so when I tell you that he broke his post, I want you to understand that I am not describing a small thing. I am describing a man setting down the very discipline that was his pride deliberately in front of a crowd, for a reason he judged to be larger than the discipline itself. His eyes turned first. He let them turn, let himself look fully at the old man on his knees on the cobbles, at the cracked frame and the faded ribbons and the brass cap badge of the old pattern. And I saw his face change again, and this time it was not a tell I had to strain for. This time it was plain. Because a soldier reads another soldier the way I read a piece of leather, by the grain of him, by the marks the work has left, and the young guard had been reading the old man since the first words at the rail, and now he had the proof of it in his hands. He saw the badge of his own regiment in the old pattern. He saw 3 campaign medals on a man who had polished his cracked boots to come and stand at attention before the gate. And he understood faster than I did, faster than any of the rest of us, exactly who was kneeling on the cobbles in front of him. He brought his rifle up. There was a snap to it, a precision, the first sound he had made all morning, and the crowd flinched at it. He brought the rifle up off the cobbles and to his shoulder in a single clean motion, and for half a heartbeat I think Price believed he was about to do as he'd been told, about to use the thing to move the old man along, and Price's face had on it a small, ugly satisfaction. And then the guard stepped off his post. He came out from beside the sentry box. He came across the worn cobbles, across the very patch the old man had been staring at, the place where the guards had stood for centuries, and the sound of his boots on the stone was the loudest thing in the forecourt, because everything else had gone silent. The band had stopped. The hammering had stopped. The whole great busy machine of the rehearsal had ground to a halt, because a Selden-foot guard had left his post in the middle of the morning, and there is no one in that place, from the youngest carpenter to the steward himself, who does not understand that such a thing does not happen, that it is very nearly against the laws of nature, and that if it is happening then the morning has tilted into something none of them had prepared for. He did not go to Price. He gave Price nothing at all, did not look at him, passed him as if he were one of the potted bay trees. He went to the old man, and he knelt. He knelt down on the cobbles beside the old soldier, the gray mantle pooling around him, and he set his rifle aside, laid it across his knee with that same care, a guard's care, a thing never set down carelessly, and he reached out and he helped the old man gather up the frame. His white gloves on the old cracked frame, steadying it, turning it over to check the glass. And I heard him speak. The first words I had heard him say low, meant only for the old man, though in the silence they carried to those of us nearest the rail. "It's not broken, Sergeant," he said. "The glass is cracked, but the metals are sound. Look, they're sound." The old man looked up at him, and something moved across the old face that I have no good word for. Sergeant. The young guard had called him Sergeant. And I understood, watching, that the old man had not heard that word, that title in a very long time, that perhaps no one had called him by his old rank in 20 years, that he had become to the world just an old poor man in a threadbare coat, and that this young guardsman in the uniform of his own regiment had looked at him and seen, instantly and certainly, the soldier he had been. "You know it," the old man said. His voice had gone to almost nothing. "The badge, you know it." The guard said, "The lion couchant, we wore it until the year of the new facings." He turned the frame so the old man could see it. "Selden-foot guards, you stood here." "I stood here," the old man said. 51 years ago I stood my first watch on this gate, this box." He lifted one shaking hand toward the western box, the very box the young guard had left. "This one. They put me on this one my first morning. I was 18. He stopped. His chest worked. "I wanted to stand it once more before. That's all I came for, to stand my watch once more where I stood it first. I wasn't loitering. I'd not loiter at this gate. I'd sooner die." "I know it, Sergeant," the young guard said. "I know you would." Now there was a movement at the edge of the forecourt. I had not seen, in the held silence, the officer come, but he came now, striding fast across the cobbles from the direction of the inner court. A tall man in the dress of the Selden guards, but finer, the officer of the watch, drawn by the unthinkable news that a sentry had left the Lion Gate. He came with a face like thunder, because of course he did, because in the first instant he knew only that one of his guardsmen had committed the gravest breach of the regiment's discipline, in full view of the public on a rehearsal morning, and there is no officer alive who would not come running at such a thing with thunder in his face. Price saw him coming and his confidence flooded back. "There," he said, pointing, his voice rising with relief and grievance. "There, officer, your man has abandoned his post." I gave a simple instruction to clear a vagrant from the gate, and instead he looked at him kneeling in the dirt with a beggar. I'll have him. This is a disgrace, an absolute disgrace. I'll be reporting this to. Be quiet. Officer had not raised his voice. He had said it almost mildly, the way a man says a thing he is entirely certain of. But it stopped Price as if a door had been shut on him. The officer was not looking at Price. He had come to a halt a few feet from the kneeling pair, and he was looking down at the old man, at the frame in the old man's hands, at the 3 medals and the brass badge of the old pattern, and I watched the thunder go out of his face. I watched it drain away and leave something else behind, something I had not expected to see on the face of a hard senior soldier. I watched him go pale, and then I watched him go very still, and then I watched him do a thing that I will carry with me to my own grave. He came to attention. He drew himself up, this tall, hard officer, and he brought his heels together and he raised his hand and gave the old man on the cobbles a full and formal salute, held it, his arm trembling slightly with the rigor of it, his eyes fixed on the old man's face. "Color Sergeant Marlowe," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "Forgive me, we did not know you'd come." The old man's mouth worked. He could not speak. "Know your name, Color Sergeant," the officer said. "Every man who has worn this badge knows your name. They teach us your name in the first week before they teach us anything else. The crossing at Hallow Ford, you're in the regimental history. Your name is read out every year on the regiment's day in the chapel with the others who held the line." He paused, and I saw him swallow. "You held the line, Color Sergeant. We were taught that you held it when there was no reason left to hold it. When the order to fall back never came, and you held it anyway 3 days, until the relief came up. We were taught that the regiment is what it is today because of the men who held at Hallow Ford, because of you. I learned the rest of it later, in pieces, from the talk that ran through the crowd and the city in the days after. I will not pretend to the details of a battle 50 years gone. But the shape of it was this: that as a young color sergeant, this man Marlowe had held a crossing on a flooded river with a handful of the regiment when the rest had been driven back, that the order to withdraw had been sent but had never reached him, that he had held the position for 3 days against odds the histories call impossible, on the assumption that he had not been told to leave and therefore must not leave, and that his holding of it had saved the larger part of the army and turned a rout into a stand, that he had been decorated for it, that the regiment counted it among its proudest hours, and that afterward, as such things go, the war had ended, and the young men who survived it had grown old, and the world had moved on to other wars and then to no wars at all, and the color sergeant who had held Hallow Ford had become, across 50 long and ordinary years, simply an old poor man in a mended coat, living God knew how, on God knew what. Until the morning came when he polished his cracked boots and combed his thin hair and carried his medals across the city to stand his watch once more at the gate where he had stood at first. He had outlived his fame. He had outlived everyone who had stood beside him at the crossing. He had outlived the world that knew what he had done. And he had come, at the end of all of it, asking nothing, to stand for a little while at a brass rail and look at a worn place on the cobbles. And a steward in a fine coat had called him a vagrant and ordered him cleared away. I looked at Price. I could not help it. I wanted to see his face in that moment, and I am not proud of the wanting, but I will be honest about it. His face had gone the color of old tallow. He had heard it all, the regimental history, the chapel, the name read out every year, and he had understood, finally, completely, what he had done. He had laid hands on a hero of the kingdom. He had knocked a color sergeant's medals to the cobbles. He had ordered a soldier whose name is taught to recruits in their first week to be dragged from the gate he once defended, and he had done it loudly, in front of 100 witnesses, with the small, ugly satisfaction of a man enjoying his power over the weak. And there is no fine coat in the world that can cover a man once a crowd has seen that in him. He had wanted, all morning, to control how things looked. And now he stood in the center of the forecourt and was seen exactly as he was, and there was nothing he could do about it at all. He opened his mouth. I think he meant to explain himself. There is always, in such men, the instinct to explain, to find the words that will put the picture back the way it was. But there were no such words, and some animal part of him knew it, and his mouth closed again. "You may go," the officer said to him, without turning his head. "Your services here are concluded. I'll have your name and your authority before you leave the grounds, and you'll answer for this to the controller's office, but you may go from my sight now, and I'll thank you to do it quickly." Price went. He went the way such men always go in the end, quickly and without dignity, his fine coat suddenly looking like what it was, a covering and nothing more. And the crowd parted to let him through and did not trouble to hide what was in their faces. And that, I think, was the worst of it for him, the parting and the faces, and I did not feel sorry for him, and I do not feel sorry for him now. But the steward's leaving was not the thing. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to make this a story about the punishment of a cruel man, and that is the smallest part of it and the least worth the telling. The thing I have carried, the thing I came home unable to speak of, was the old soldier and the young one, still on their knees on the cobbles with the cracked frame between them. The young guard helped him up. It took a while. The old joints did not want to unfold, and the guard was patient, taking the old man's weight, steadying him by the elbow the way you steady something precious. And when at last the color sergeant was on his feet, he stood swaying for a moment, and then he straightened again, drew his shoulders back again, that same costly straightening I had seen when he first came to the rail, and he looked at the worn place on the cobbles before the western box, and he looked at the young man in the gray mantle, and he said, "I only wanted to stand at my watch once more." And the young guard looked at the officer. I do not know what passed between them. There were no words, but the officer gave a small nod, and the young guard turned to the color sergeant and he said, "Then stand it, sergeant, stand your watch. I'll stand it with you. There's no shame on this gate could touch you, and there's no man here will move you. Stand it as long as you like." And he handed the old man the rifle. He put his own rifle into the old soldier's hands, and the color sergeant took it, and his shaking steadied, the way a man's hands steady on a thing they have held 10,000 times, the body remembering what the years had taken from the mind, and he brought it to the order, but grounded, hands one over the other on the muzzle, in the manner he had been taught 51 years before. And the young guard stood at his shoulder at attention, bareheaded now in the sense that matters, his post given over, and the two of them stood the watch together at the lion gate of Selden Court, the old man and the young, while the forecourt stood silent around them, and the sun came down on the worn cobbles. The officer came to attention beside me, beside us at the rail on the public side, where the crowd was, and he saluted, and he held it. And then a strange thing began to happen, a thing that I have never seen before or since, and that I cannot fully account for. Down the line of the rehearsal, the other guardsmen, the ones who had been standing easy or working through their drill, came one by one to attention and raised their hands and saluted, until the whole line of gray mantles stood rigid and saluting the old man at the gate. And then the workmen, the carpenters and the flagmen and the bandsmen, ordinary men in shirt sleeves, men who did not know the regimental history and had never read the name in any chapel, they took off their caps. They did not salute. They were not soldiers, but they took off their caps and held them against their chests, because a man does not need to know the history to understand what he is looking at when an old soldier stands his last watch and the young one stands it with him. And the crowd. I will tell you what the crowd did, though I was part of it, and it is hard to describe a thing you are inside of. The crowd was silent, and the crowd wept. Not all of us, and not loudly, but I looked along the rail, and I saw the two young women with their hands over their mouths and tears running down, and I saw the man with the sketchbook standing with it forgotten at his side and his face working, and I saw fathers lift their children higher, not to see a spectacle now, but to make sure they saw this, whatever it was, this thing that they would not be able to explain to them, and that they wanted them to have seen anyway. And I stood at the rail with my saddler's hands gripping the brass, and I thought of my father who had set his discipline down and become ordinary, who had envied these men, and I understood at last what he had envied, and I wept for him, for the soldier he had been and had had to stop being, and I wept for the old man at the gate who had not been allowed to stop, who had carried it all the way to the end, 51 years, to stand his watch once more. He stood it for perhaps a quarter of an hour. That was all his body would give him. And when at last he began to sway, the young guard took the rifle gently from his hands, and the officer came and took his other arm, an officer of the Selden Foot Guards supporting an old man across the cobbles as if he were carrying the regiment's own colors, and they brought him in through the lion gate, through the great doors, into the inner court where the public does not go. They did not turn him out into the square. They brought him in. I learned later that they kept him, that the regiment, once it knew he lived and knew the state he lived in, would not let him go back to whatever lodging-house corner he had crawled out of that morning. That there is a thing called the regimental fund, and a thing called the obligation of the colors, and that the color sergeant who held Hallow Ford spent the last part of his life. It was not long, a year and some months, I heard, in honor and in comfort, and in the company of men who knew his name, and that when he died he was buried with the regiment, with the salute and the slow march and the name read out. And that the young guard who had stepped off his post stood in the honor party at the grave. I learned the young guard's name too in the end. It was Cole, Guardsman Cole. There was talk in the days after that he might be disciplined for leaving his post, because the law of the thing was the law of the thing, and a guard had broken it before a crowd. And it is true that he was called before his officers. But I heard, and I believe it, that the officer of the watch spoke for him, and that what the officer said was this: that the first duty of a guard at the Lion Gate is to defend the honor of the regiment, and that everything else, the standing and the stillness and the not moving, is only the form that duty usually takes, that on most mornings the honor of the regiment is best served by a man standing like a statue and letting the world flow past him. But that on one particular morning, the honor of the regiment required a man to see what no one else could see, and to know the difference between the rule and the reason for the rule, and to step off his post and kneel down on the cobbles and put his rifle into the hands of an old soldier who had been called a vagrant at the gate he once defended. And that a guard who could not tell those 2 mornings apart was no use to anyone, and a guard who could was exactly the kind of man the regiment existed to make. They did not discipline him. I am glad of it. I have been glad of it for years. I went home the next day. My wife saw my face and asked me what had happened, and I found I could not tell her, not then. The words would not come, and what came instead were the tears I had been holding since the gate. It was weeks before I could speak of it plainly, and even now, telling it whole, I find I have to stop and gather myself in the places I did not expect to. I have thought a great deal in the years since about why it moved me as it did, a man not given to wonder, a man who measures the world by whether a strap will hold. And I think it is this: I had gone to the Lion Gate to see discipline. I had wanted to see the famous stillness, the men who could not be made to break, and I will not pretend that stillness is not a fine and difficult thing, because it is. But what I saw that morning was greater than stillness, and it taught me that I had misunderstood the whole of it, the way a man can misunderstand a thing for 40 years. I had thought the discipline was the not moving. I had thought the strength of those men lay in their refusal, that they were strong because nothing could make them stir. But that was the form, not the substance. The substance was underneath. The discipline was never about holding still. It was about knowing exactly and completely what you were holding still for and being ready on the one morning in 1,000 when the reason called for it, to set the form down and serve the thing itself. The young guard's stillness all morning and his stepping off his post at the end were not 2 different things. They were the same thing. They were both entirely the keeping of his faith. He held still for the honor of the regiment, and he moved for the honor of the regiment. And the honor of the regiment was an old man in cracked boots who had carried his medals across the city to stand his watch once more. My father is long gone now. I never got to tell him what I saw. But I told it once to a young man at a graveside, Cole's own son, as it happened, years on, at the burial of the man who had been the officer of the watch that morning, the 2 families bound by that day ever after, and the young man listened, and at the end of it he said to me, "Why are you telling me this, sir?" And I gave him the only answer I have, because some things a man witnesses are not given to him for his own keeping. They are given to him to carry. and I am old now myself, older than I like to think, and I will not always be here to carry it. So I am setting it down for whoever stands the next watch, the true thing under the form, the reason under the rule, that the man who will not move and the man who knows the one morning he must are the same man, and that the whole long discipline of standing still is only ever in the end, the keeping ready to honor what is worth honoring, when at last it comes walking, slow and poor and unbowed, across the square.